Thank you. When the explorer Cook descended on the islands of Hawaii, essentially, he came upon the natives who were toiling in the land, and they never looked up from their work to look at Cook's massive ship that approached, because they never thought that such technology could exist in the first place. The same thing is the case with climate change. We have come to the point where perhaps we are not able to really rationalize what we are doing to our environment, what is happening to the environment because of the processes that we engage in every day in our lives. My research actually looks at the construction of reality that the Las Vegas Review-Journal has portrayed over time from 1987 until present day to look at how climate change is discussed, essentially, so we can understand this better. I'm incorporating in particular framing theory, this idea that things can be framed in a certain way, whether they're attributing climate change to certain government entities, individuals, groups. I'm looking at human interest stories, whether or not we're talking about human beings that are actually impacted by climate change. I'm looking at conflict, whether or not there are discussions of whether or not climate change actually exists. I'm also looking at morality, whether or not religion is discussed, whether or not particular actions are promoted as being what we should do in order to mitigate our impacts. And also I'm looking at economics as well. How do we discuss the costs associated with climate change? How do we discuss perhaps economic impacts of what will occur in the future? I'm also looking at whether or not articles tend to discuss scope, essentially, whether or not we're looking at the Southwest region, regional, national coverage, whether or not it covers the entire span of the United States, and also international, whether we're looking at multiple countries and the impacts of climate change on a global scale. One of my preliminary findings has found that these articles over time have become increasingly narrower on the Las Vegas landscape. The Las Vegas Review-Journal is a Republican paper. It's a right-wing paper, if you will. And yet it has actually narrowed its focus over time to discuss the issues with climate change, and specifically our issues with Lake Mead and our dependence on the Colorado River. As you know, or may not, the Colorado is in a severe drought, and Lake Mead is actually at its lowest point now as it ever has been since the mid-30s, I believe. Okay, so we're looking at this idea that regardless of its political orientation, we are becoming increasingly focused on the region. And if we can understand better how climate change is portrayed, whether or not oftentimes the costs are discussed, whether or not human cost is discussed, whether or not we're still talking about whether or not climate change still exists, this will help us recognize what is actually happening and help us grapple with the ship that is indeed on our shorelines. Thank you.